The sky thundered with roaring jets. Bombs rained down in seconds. At first, people thought this must be an enemy attack. But the truth was far more terrifying. It was their own government bombing them. This is the forgotten story of Mizoram. When people talk about India's struggles, they usually mention partition, Kashmir, Punjab, or the emergency. But hidden in the hills of the Northeast lies a story many have never truly heard. The story of Mizoram. A story that began with famine. A story that turned neighbors into rebels. A story where Indian fighter jets bombed Indian citizens. And finally, a story that ended in one of the most successful peace accords this country has ever seen. If you think that sounds unbelievable, you're not alone. Most Indians outside the Northeast barely know it happened. But for the Mizos, this isn't just history, it's lived memory. So let's go back to the late 1950s. To a time when hunger, neglect, and silence sparked a movement that shook Delhi to its core. And trust me, once you hear how Mizoram went from famine to peace, you'll wonder why this isn't taught in every Indian classroom. The famine that sparked a fire. It all began with bamboo. Every 50 years or so, something eerie happens in Mizoram. The bamboo forests bloom. It's a rare natural cycle called mautam. And when the bamboo flowers, the rats come. Not a few, not dozens, but thousands upon thousands, multiplying at terrifying speed. In 1959, the hills of Mizoram were hit by this disaster. The rats swarmed into fields and granaries. They chewed through sacks of rice, gnawed at maize, and stripped farms bare. Villagers tried to fight them off with traps and fire, but nothing worked. The harvest was gone. Soon, famine followed. Families starved. Parents watched helplessly as children wasted away. Old people died quietly, their rice bowls empty. The roads that once carried trade now carried nothing but stories of hunger. People cried out for help. But Mizoram back then wasn't even a state. It was just the Lushai Hills district under Assam. And the Assam government, their response was slow, bureaucratic, and indifferent. Relief came, but far too late. For the Mizos, this wasn't just about famine. It was about dignity. They felt ignored, treated like their lives didn't matter. That sense of abandonment dug deep, and in that wound, a fire began to grow. Think about it. If your people are starving, and the government drags its feet while rats eat your harvest, how long before you stop trusting the system altogether? The birth of the MNF. Out of famine rose a movement. At first, it was the Mizo National Famine Front, a group formed simply to help people survive the crisis. They organized relief, distributed what little food they had, and carried the community through the worst. But as the famine ended, the front didn't fade away. Instead, it transformed. People began to say, if Delhi doesn't care about us in our darkest hour, maybe we don't belong with Delhi at all. This is where a man named Laldenga came into picture. To understand the struggle, you have to understand the man at the center of it, Laldenga. He didn't start out as a warrior. He was once a government clerk, an ordinary job, an ordinary life. But the famine of 1959 changed him. He saw how his people suffered and how the government ignored them. From then on, he believed the Mizos needed to rule themselves. Charismatic, persuasive, and stubborn, he became the leader of the MNF. But he wasn't just sitting in Mizoram directing things. He spent much of the insurgency abroad, in what was then East Pakistan, later Bangladesh, and even in London. From there, he lobbied, sought international support, and kept the dream of independence alive. For Delhi, this made him both dangerous and frustrating. They couldn't catch him, but his influence in the hills remained strong. What made Laldenga unusual was his dual nature. He was a guerrilla leader, yes, but he was also a negotiator. He wasn't blinded by ideology. He knew, at least deep down, that independence might never come. But autonomy, dignity, and statehood, those were goals worth fighting for. How does a man go from being called an enemy of the state to shaking hands with the Prime Minister in New Delhi? Laldenga's journey would prove that sometimes rebels don't just die in forests. Sometimes they walk into Parliament. Under the leadership of Laldenga, a young and charismatic figure, the Famine Front evolved into the Mizo National Front, MNF. Its goal, complete independence for Mizoram. Laldenga spoke with passion. He told Mizos they were a proud people, with their own history, their own songs, their own faith. He argued that they should no longer be treated as a forgotten corner of Assam or a neglected part of India. For many who had lost loved ones in the famine, his words hit home. And in the jungles, whispers began to grow. Freedom, independence, a land of our own, rebellion in the hills. By the mid-1960s, the Mizo Hills were simmering, and then in 1966, it boiled over. The MNF decided to act. On March 1st, 1966, they launched Operation Jericho, a daring, coordinated attack across the hills. Rebels stormed government offices, seized weapons, cut communication lines. For a brief moment, it looked as if the MNF might actually take control, and that's when Delhi responded. The Indian Army was sent in full force. But what came next was something no one expected. In Aizawl, the state's heart, Indian fighter jets roared overhead. Bombs rained down, houses were set ablaze, smoke curled over the hills. Families ran into the forests, clutching children, hiding in caves. It was the first and only time in independent India's history that the government ordered airstrikes on its own citizens. For the Mizos, the message was brutal. India would not tolerate secession. For Delhi, it was about crushing rebellion quickly and decisively. But the scars of that day never healed. Ask any elder in Aizawl, and they'll tell you. The sound of jets still haunts their memory. Imagine watching your hometown bombed, not by enemies, but by the very country you're supposed to belong to. Would you ever feel the same again? Life behind barbed wires. The grouping of villages, Delhi realized that defeating the MNF wasn't easy. The rebels knew the forests. They moved like shadows, fed and sheltered by sympathetic villages. So the government changed tactics. They launched a policy called the grouping of villages. Entire villages were emptied. Families were forced to leave their ancestral homes. Soldiers burned down huts to make sure no one returned. People were herded into new, tightly controlled settlements along the roads. These grouped villages were often surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by security forces. Food was scarce. Sanitation was poor. Diseases spread quickly. It was survival, but without dignity. Children grew up without knowing their original homes. Elders wept as they saw generations-old traditions vanish. Farmers longed for their fields, now abandoned to jungle. For many, it felt like living in a prison camp. And yet, Mizos endured. They sang hymns in the evenings. They clung to faith. They found strength in community, even in captivity. The guns may have belonged to the army and the MNF, but the heaviest price was paid by ordinary villagers, caught between two fires. The rebel struggle and the Mizo spirit. Through the 1970s, the struggle dragged on. The MNF set up bases across the border in East Pakistan. Fighters were trained, supplied, and sent back into the hills to wage guerrilla war. India retaliated with sweeping operations. Villages lived in constant fear, rebels by night, soldiers by day. Trust broke down. To feed a rebel meant punishment from the army. To refuse meant punishment from the MNF. Survival meant walking a tightrope. And yet, something remarkable happened. Despite famine, bombings, and displacement, the Mizo spirit held firm. The church became a refuge. Hymns echoed even in grouped villages. Families told stories to remind children who they were. Songs carried hope when food was scarce. Mizos began to believe, no matter how long the struggle, they would not vanish. The world shifts. History, however, has its own way of intervening. When you're fighting a powerful state like India, you look for allies. The MNF knew they couldn't survive forever in the forests of Mizoram, so they reached out. In the late 1960s and 70s, MNF rebels began crossing into East Pakistan. There they found safe havens. The Pakistani military trained them, supplied them with weapons, and hoped to use them as leverage against India. For a while, it worked. The MNF regrouped, stronger and better armed. Guerrilla raids intensified. Delhi tightened its grip. The cycle of violence dragged on. But history has a way of flipping the script. In 1971, East Pakistan became Bangladesh after a bloody war of independence. India supported Bangladesh, and suddenly, the MNF's sanctuary crumbled. Their bases were overrun. Supplies ran thin. Some rebels even looked towards China, hoping for communist support. But Mizoram's deep Christian roots and cultural distance made it hard to forge real bonds. The MNF was left isolated, tired, and stretched thin. Think about it. You fight for decades, but suddenly your allies vanish. Your people are exhausted. Your own fighters are questioning the path. What do you do then? The turning point. By the early 1980s, Mizoram had been at war for nearly 2 decades. Whole generations had grown up under curfews and checkpoints. Delhi had tried force. The MNF had tried rebellion. Neither side had won. Something had to change. In 1984, Rajiv Gandhi became India's Prime Minister. Young, energetic, and eager to break with old ways, he brought a new approach to the Northeast. Unlike previous leaders, Rajiv believed that peace could come only through dialogue, not just the barrel of a gun. Quietly, back-channel talks began with Lal Denga, who was then living in London. The Indian government had tried before, but this time the mood was different. Both sides were tired. Both sides were ready to consider compromise. Lal Denga was invited to Delhi. He came, cautiously, still wearing the air of a rebel leader, but willing to talk. Imagine the scene. In a government bungalow, the once outlawed leader of the MNF sitting across the table from India's young Prime Minister. For 20 years, they had fought each other. Now, they were searching for common ground. The Mizo Accord. The breakthrough came in the summer of 1986. On June 30th, 1986, the historic Mizo Peace Accord was signed in New Delhi. The MNF agreed to give up arms. The guerrilla fighters who had roamed the forests would lay down their guns. The underground government of the MNF would dissolve. In return, the Indian government promised full statehood for Mizoram, with special safeguards to protect the identity and culture of the Mizo people. Even more importantly, the accord promised rehabilitation. Rebels who came over ground would not be treated as criminals, but as citizens. They would be given a chance to rebuild their lives. When the accord was announced, the reaction in Mizoram was electric. For the first time in 20 years, people dared to hope. Churches rang their bells. Families came out of hiding. The sound of gunfire gave way to the sound of prayers. And in the forests, MNF fighters began to walk back into villages, carrying their rifles not as tools of war, but as symbols to surrender. For Delhi, this was a rare triumph. For Mizoram, it was a rebirth, a new dawn in Mizoram. In 1987, Mizoram officially became India's 23rd state. And for the first time, Mizos had their own government, their own voice. Former rebels traded jungle fatigues for suits. Some even became leaders in the new democratic system. Roads were built, schools opened, churches flourished. Peace brought a transformation few had imagined possible. From being one of India's most troubled regions, Mizoram became one of its most peaceful. The story of Mizoram is unlike any other in India. It shows us the cost of neglect, how a famine ignored by leaders turned into a 20-year insurgency, how force and bombings failed to crush a people's spirit. And maybe that's why the Mizo Accord still stands tall today, while so many other peace deals in the Northeast have crumbled. So when you think of Mizoram, don't just think of quiet hills and beautiful choirs. Remember the struggle, remember the famine, remember the years when children grew up behind barbed wire,